In today's episode of British Economic Archives, we explore one of the most humiliating and transformative events in modern British economic history. The 1976 IMF Rescue, a moment many historians now call the day Britain lost control of its own economy. To understand how a nation that once ruled a quarter of the world ended up begging for the largest IMF bailout anyone had ever seen, we must first step back into the troubled 1970s, a decade of inflation, industrial collapse, global shocks, and political chaos. Britain entered the decade already weakened. Its traditional industries, coal, steel, shipbuilding, cars, were declining rapidly as global competitors outperformed them. Productivity stagnated, public borrowing was rising, and inflation was creeping upward. Yet nothing prepared Britain for the explosion that followed the 1973 oil crisis. When OPEC quadrupled global oil prices, the UK, heavily dependent on imported energy, was thrown into turmoil. Inflation soared from 9% in 1973 to 16% in 1974, and then to a staggering 24.2% in 1975, one of the highest rates in the developed world. At the same time, unemployment climbed past 1 million people, something not seen since the interwar years. The government tried wage controls, but powerful trade unions responded with strikes that shut down transport networks, factories, and power stations. Rolling blackouts forced shops to close early, newspapers printed in dim ink, and the infamous three-day week restricted industrial electricity use. Britain's economic credibility collapsed as global investors watched a once dominant power struggle to keep the lights on. When Harold Wilson resigned unexpectedly in 1976 and James Callaghan took over as Prime Minister, he inherited an economy on life support. The pound was already falling, the deficit was spiralling, and confidence in the British government was evaporating around the world. What followed was a financial collapse so severe that Britain's ability to pay for its imports, its oil, food, medicine, and machinery, was suddenly in question. By mid-1976, international investors were abandoning the pound at record speed. Sterling, once the world's main reserve currency, fell from $2.30 to nearly $1.60 in just months. A catastrophic drop for a major global currency. Foreign lenders feared that Britain was losing control of inflation, public spending, and its overall financial direction. Newspapers in New York and Frankfurt openly speculated that the UK might soon become the first major Western economy to default on its debt. The situation became so unstable that the Bank of England began secretly selling gold reserves and borrowing from other central banks just to maintain imports. Treasury officials produced internal memos warning that the UK was running dangerously low on foreign currency reserves, the money used to buy essential goods from overseas. If these reserves ran out, Britain would be unable to purchase oil, raw materials, or food. For a developed country, this was unthinkable. On the 28th of September 1976, the crisis reached a dramatic turning point. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Denis Healey, standing at Heathrow Airport preparing to board a flight to the Labour Party conference in Blackpool, received urgent news that the pound was collapsing again. Traders were dumping sterling so aggressively that the Bank of England might not be able to stop it. Healey made an extraordinary decision. He turned around and left the airport, walking back down the aircraft stairs as television cameras recorded it live. That single image, the Chancellor abandoning plans to address his own party, became the symbol of Britain's financial panic. Over the next several weeks, the government desperately tried to stabilize the currency. The Bank of England spent millions defending the pound, but markets kept attacking. Foreign governments questioned the UK's solvency, and global investors demanded higher interest rates on British debt. Inside the Treasury, officials concluded that only one option remained. Britain needed an emergency loan to stop the collapse. And so, the unthinkable happened. The government prepared to ask the International Monetary Fund for help. The UK's request for an IMF bailout stunned the world. Britain was not just any country, it was a founding member of the IMF, a former global superpower, and once the world's financial centre. For Britain to ask for a rescue loan was seen as a national humiliation. The government requested $3.9 billion, equivalent to £17 to $20 billion today, the largest loan the IMF had ever considered. But there was a catch. To approve the loan, the IMF demanded full access to Britain's financial records. This meant foreign economists from Washington, not Westminster, were about to examine the UK's accounts and dictate what the British government could and could not spend. It was a direct challenge to British sovereignty. The IMF delegation arrived in London in October 1976, carrying folders of charts, spreadsheets, and spending models. They inspected every detail of the UK's finances: borrowing, industrial subsidies, inflation data, public service costs, nationalised industries, and wage agreements. Their conclusions were harsh but clear. Britain was borrowing too much, spending too much, and failing to control inflation. The deficit had reached nearly 10% of GDP. Productivity was lagging behind Europe and the United States, and nationalised industries like steel and coal were losing billions each year. But the IMF discovered something else, something that only became public decades later. The British government had been overly pessimistic about its own finances. According to declassified files, the Treasury had underestimated future tax revenues and overestimated future spending. In other words, the crisis was partly caused by miscalculation and panic. However, markets had already lost trust in the government. Even if the underlying numbers were not as catastrophic as they appeared, the collapse in confidence turned the crisis into a self-fulfilling prophecy. The IMF agreed to approve the loan, but only if Britain enacted sweeping spending cuts, reductions in public investment, and tighter control of wages and inflation. The proposed cuts totaled £2.50 £3 billion, roughly equivalent to tens of billions today. These cuts targeted politically explosive areas: housing, infrastructure, regional aid, and industrial support. When news of these conditions reached the public, the Labour Party erupted into open conflict. The political fallout was enormous. Labour MPs on the left accused the government of surrendering British sovereignty to foreign bankers. Trade unions condemned the IMF for imposing economic colonialism. Newspapers declared IMF rules Britain, and protests erupted outside government buildings. But Prime Minister James Callaghan and Chancellor Denis Healey had little choice. Without IMF support, the pound might collapse completely, leaving Britain unable to pay for imports. Healey accepted the IMF conditions and announced the cuts in December 1976. Many Labour ministers privately warned that the decision would destroy the party's credibility. And they were right. The crisis created deep fractures within Labour that never fully healed. Callaghan, however, stood firm. In September 1976, at the Labour Party conference, he delivered a speech now considered a defining moment of modern British politics. He famously declared, "We used to think you could spend your way out of a recession. I tell you, in all candour, that option no longer exists." Those words marked the end of the post-war economic consensus that had guided Britain since 1945. The idea that the government could manage the economy through high spending and full employment was replaced by a new philosophy: controlling inflation, limiting borrowing, and allowing market forces more freedom. Ironically, after all the pain and political turmoil, Britain never used the full IMF loan. The announcement of the rescue stabilized the markets, investor confidence slowly returned, and the pound regained strength. By 1977, Britain had drawn only half the loan. By 1979, the UK had fully repaid the IMF years ahead of schedule. Yet the political consequences were irreversible. The public had lost confidence in Labour's economic management, and when the 1979 election came, Margaret Thatcher swept to power, promising to prevent another 1976 by transforming British economic policy. The shock of the IMF crisis became the foundation for the economic reforms of the 1980s. Privatization, union restriction, monetarism, and market liberalization. Whether one supports or opposes Thatcher's policies, the truth is undeniable. The IMF crisis made her revolution possible. Today, historians view the 1976 IMF rescue as a turning point not just in British economics, but in Britain's sense of national identity. It marked the moment the UK confronted the reality that its global power was gone, its industries were uncompetitive, and its economic model was unsustainable. It marked the moment markets proved they could overpower governments, no matter how historic or prestigious. It marked the moment the old empire economic mindset finally collapsed. The crisis also taught future British governments a harsh lesson. Confidence is a currency of its own. When confidence collapses, even a major nation can find itself begging for help. In the decades since, no UK government, Labour or Conservative, has ever forgotten the IMF humiliation. It shaped decisions on borrowing, spending, privatization, and inflation for generations. Some argue the crisis forced Britain to modernize and adapt to a globalized economy. Others say it ushered in decades of inequality and deindustrialization. But all agree on one truth. The 1976 IMF rescue was one of the most important economic events in modern British history. It was the day Britain accepted that the world had changed and that it needed to change with it. It was the moment the country lost control of its economy, and the moment it began the long journey to redefine what economic power means in a post-imperial age. And if you found this deep dive fascinating, eye-opening, or valuable, then hit the like button. Share this video with someone who loves British history or economics, and make sure to subscribe to British Economic Archives. This channel brings you the real stories behind Britain's financial rise, collapse, and rebirth. Stories hidden in archives, forgotten by textbooks, and rarely told anywhere else. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.